So our first presenter is Michael Ito from University of Michigan. His field is computer science, and his advisor is Jenna Wiens, and he did his practicum at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And it's also his birthday today.
I was supposed to say that. All right, surprise. Yeah, so this is the first time I've actually given a talk on my birthday. If this goes well, I'll continue scheduling. If not, this is the last. But I am excited to talk here today about my work and my contributions to geometric deep learning and working with symmetry. But before I get into all of that, I will motivate the talk with, I think, its most important application. And so, despite all the advancements in medicine, it is the case that many major diseases like advanced cancers and neurodegenerative diseases and infectious diseases all still lack effective treatments. And this makes drug discovery one of the most important and scientific challenges of our time. And at the same time, it's still the case that despite all the advancements in biology and chemistry and compute, pharmaceutical R&D productivity has been declining over time. And since 1950, the number of drugs have actually, per US $1 billion, has actually been steadily decreasing. All right, and at the same time, it is the case that AI actually has the promise to reverse this trend. And since 2015, the number of AI-discovered drugs that have entered clinical trials have been exponentially increasing. But yet, AI for drug discovery is fundamentally challenging. And this is because drugs and their targets all live in complex geometric domains where it's important to capture their symmetries. And so one way that you might represent your drug is with a graph. And this is a very natural abstraction, right? Every node in our drug, or every node in our graph represents an atom, and every bond represents an edge. And to illustrate the idea of symmetries here, I have two graphs, and I've labeled them such that they're just not identical. You can write down their adjacency matrices and just compare them, and they wouldn't be equal. There does, however, obviously exist some permutation of the labels such that when I hit G with this permutation pi, all of a sudden, these two graphs become identical, right? And you can check this by showing that, like, if I have an edge that exists in pi g, you'll find it somewhere in H. And so obviously, the right characterization is that these two things are isomorphic. And since the labeling of my graph doesn't really depend on how arbitrarily I label it, we want our neural networks to respect this symmetry. If I run a neural network on G and H, I want the same output. All right. And let's formalize things a bit. So for the entirety of the talk, I'll be in the supervised learning classic setup, where I have some data set of pairs, X and Y. X are our graphs, and Y are our targets. And we're going to want to be minimizing some expected risk. And the idea is that we want to incorporate symmetries into this formulation. And so the idea is that given some group G, we're going to want to select some function f that is G invariant or G equivariant that satisfies the condition above, minimizing some expected risk. And the invariant condition is that if for all, I want for all G in my group and for all X, I want f of Gx is equal to f of x, the invariant condition. And the equivariant condition is just that G is reflected in the output. All right. And the popular way that people usually do machine learning on graphs is with what's called graph neural networks. And they capture this thing, they capture this symmetry architecturally. And the idea is that for every node, I'm going to update that node's representation using the aggregation of its immediate neighbors. And as I do this iteratively, I essentially see more of the graph, right? Your GNN's receptive field increases, and you start seeing higher order neighbors. And OK, I must admit, this is like quite the elegant operation. I don't know how else you would like actually do ML on graphs. It might take you like perhaps a PhD to try to beat these things. OK, but in any case, this architectural invariance, despite its elegance, actually limits expressive power, which I'll get into a bit deeper. And it leads to other things, unwanted things like oversmoothing and oversquashing, which we don't really have to worry about for now. To illustrate the expressivity point, I have here two obviously non-isomorphic graphs, right? One set of graphs is like two disjoint 3 cycles, and one set of graphs is just a 6 cycle. And it is the case that if you run a GNN on these graphs, for infinity, for however long or however deep you want your GNN to be, their receptive fields, the GNN's receptive field, will actually be identical for both graphs, and it'll have no chance in distinguishing these cycles, right? Okay, and so given this result, it's actually like kind of non-trivial. There are some severe implications for our GNNs. And the first is that we lose all notions of universality. What this means is that a GNN is limited in expressive power. It fundamentally can't fit certain functions. All right, the second consequence is actually of much more practical significance. If our GNNs can't detect cycles or distinguish cycles, and we want to do machine learning on drugs, we're going to be in a bit of an issue, because we're going to have a bit of an issue because drugs actually depend on cycles, and they're very key there. And so in light of these consequences and these limitations, which we've actually shown in my first 2 years of the PhD, we want to propose, like, can we find alternative routes to this invariance? And this is the second key idea of the PhD, is that can we use elegant techniques to obtain invariants like randomization and canonicalization? And these are like the standards in classical ML. And I do show that, like, actually, if you do leverage these things in the right way, you can increase expressive power, you can have generalizable graph neural networks, and you can have efficient neural networks. And I'll be walking through what we do with these two ideas in this talk. All right, so the first idea is randomization, and we can use this as a route to invariance. And the idea is that we're going to use data augmentation, which averages over randomly sampled input transformations to obtain an invariant output. Right? Despite our CNN not being rotation invariant, we can feed it randomized versions of the input, and we can average over them to obtain the invariant output. And one way you might do this for graphs is actually another elegant way, or another elegant tool on graphs, is to leverage random walks. And so random walk neural networks is sort of like the model that we first focus on. And the idea here is that you're going to first sample random walks from your graph, which are like little beads here. You're going to embed them into structured feature matrices, and then you're going to run a sequence model on those structured feature matrices, and then you're going to aggregate to obtain your invariant representation. Okay, and I want to pause here for a little bit and talk about the intuition a bit, is that the reason why we're going through all these hoops and jumping through all these hoops to, like, actually use these sequence models, like, for instance, a transformer, is that we want universality. We want this guarantee that if we do machine learning on graphs, we are in the universal regime where we can fit any function. So that's the whole intuition, is that we want to leverage these universal models. Okay, and the first thing that we show, the first contribution really, is like there is this expressive gap even with random walk neural networks, and this arises in the form of coverage. And so if the expressivity, like an RWNN's expressivity depends on its sampler's ability to achieve full coverage. And under partial coverage, they're obviously significantly limited. And like the intuition here is like below in this bottom left, is that obviously if my random walks don't see all of my graph, then how can I reconstruct that graph? Okay, and the kicker is that actually there's some theory that really establishes that, like, the node cover times, which are the expected number of steps you would take in a walk to cover all nodes, like scales as v times e, the number of nodes times the number of edges. And even for optimal first order walks, you get like v squared. And our idea is that we should be able to do better. This is like not very good. Okay, and so what we propose is these random depth first searches. And there's a couple of nice things about this. Searches necessarily obtain full node coverage, right, with just a single depth first search. And then we'll show later on that we actually only need like a small number of them to guarantee edge coverage. And okay, this part is a little bit technical, but like I will mention is that like we do use and leverage this new notion of invariance, which we'll call probabilistic invariance, is that it doesn't satisfy the exact functional invariance that you'd expect from like a architecturally strict GNN, but we relax it a bit, and we actually have this notion of probabilistic invariance, which grants us invariance and expectation. Anyway, the way we do it is we sample a start node uniformly at random, and then we'll visit neighbors uniformly, unseen neighbors uniformly at random, and then we'll just enumerate out this search. Okay, and another contribution is that we actually show that, like, if you're in a regime where you have sparse graphs of bounded degree, kind of like molecules, then you actually only need a logarithmic number of these searches to actually cover all your edges of your graph. And the intuition for this is that the subgraphs induced by our search actually is a spanning tree. And on sparse graphs, you're hitting most of the edges with your spanning tree. You're only really missing like a few in the cycles. And we have this nice result which says that under the full coverage lemma, under universal sequence encoders, then we actually have a universal model on sparse bounded degree graphs, which is exactly what we want. Okay, and the other thing I want to mention is that like this might be a little much, but like there is this deep connection to like to smile strings, right? And smile strings forms this like canonical single string of your graph, right? You're gonna first rank all your atoms, then you're gonna like run a DFS on that, and then you get a single string. What we've done here is actually we've randomized this process. And so what I want to make the point is that like this randomized search thing isn't like a random idea. It isn't like a random idea in the sense that it came out of nowhere. That has this very deep tie to what chemists use and like what's been used in the past, like way back in like the 80s. Okay. And so to show that like some of these results that we've shown, to show some of these things actually lead to some improvements, we test on these small molecules and protein data sets. We do show that we outperform like the traditional neural net and traditional GNNs and graph transformers. And we also show that like when we match the budgets of like what we give the random walk and what we give our random searches, we like significantly improve on performance, especially in like the low walk regimes or low sample regimes. Okay, and so this randomization thing was very nice and very cool, but it actually takes a while to train. This is where like HPC comes in, but it actually does take a while to train, and the reason is that you're forcing your model to be invariant across training, and this can obviously take a long time. Your model sees like many different input transformations and things like this, and so a cheaper route is what we propose next. Is we propose a canonical route, right? So rather than randomly making these transformations to our data, what we're going to do is we're going to use like a canonical map that maps all the equivalent inputs under a certain symmetry group to a certain unique canonical representative. And the idea is that if we have a CNN, which is not rotation invariant, we can apply our CNN on this rotation invariant input to obtain an invariant output. Okay, and the way that people do this in graph neural networks, we've actually had to do a bit of like formalization and a bit of like digging to actually make this case. But like Smiles does the same thing, is that we have some node labeler pi_v, and this will like assign scores to all our nodes in the graph. And then you flatten your graph according to some canonical sequence map. And then you apply, again, like a universal sequence encoder. And the idea is, again, the same intuition that we want to use universal models on these inputs. And what we do is we essentially like pose the question, like, what goes wrong when you do this thing? Like, when you do this operation, like, canonicalization is a really elegant idea, and I really like it. But like, it must go wrong somewhere, and it actually does. And so we have this warm up on the star node graph, which is like a graph of n nodes, on like n nodes in a star. And it is the case that like any labeling pi_v and canonicalizer cseq incurs stretch O of n because there are always two leaf nodes in our graph that are O of n in the sequence. And contraction 2, because there's always two leaf nodes in our graph that are adjacent in the sequence. So you're like stretching and contracting distances when you're transforming your input into the sequence. And we also like pose this other argument that canonical sequences form a poor coordinate system for the graph, right? Like nodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all different distances in your sequence to 0, but they're all equidistant in the graph. And so we really don't like this thing that we're doing to the distances. And we can obtain like a general bound, which I really won't go through too much because there's only 2 minutes. But the idea is that like we've actually obtained a general lower bound for how well you can do for like stretching and contracting distances. And it turns out to be related to the graph bandwidth, if anybody's familiar with that. But what we can do is we can actually like analyze the stretch across different classes of graphs, right? So for stars and complete graphs, obviously you're going to have to stretch by a factor of O of n. For balanced binary trees, you get something like n over log n. And really, like one of the only good cases is paths, where you can preserve a distance from a path to a path, obviously. And our approach is to use canonical spanning trees. The idea is that we're going to extract our trees using an MST algorithm. And the intuition is that trees should better preserve distances on sparse graphs. And what we're going to do is we're going to leverage first, like the initial node labels. We're going to use the node labels to derive edge labels. Then we're going to extract an MST. And the edges unseen by the MST are going to be upweighted at the next round, such that when I extract more MSTs, they're going to form a cover. You're essentially going to have this canonical spanning tree cover over your graph. Then we can apply expressive tree neural networks to those trees and aggregate to form an invariant representation. I'm sorry, here's again another bound, but like there's only 40 seconds left. The idea is that like we do show other bounds for like how well trees do. And in general, you can like hopefully just come away with the intuition that they do better than sequences in capturing structure, and capturing and preserving these distances, which is quite intuitive. Okay, and so we test against a bunch of like canonical GNNs, which are domain driven, ones like smiles and primary sequences for proteins. We test against learnable ones, and we test against algorithmic ones. And here's our contributions. We first establish in the first sort of like part that I kind of glazed over is that like popular GNNs are limited due to their strict architectural invariances. And then we propose two alternatives. These approaches, RSNNs and CTNNs, they're expressive, they're generalizable, and they're efficient. And then we also demonstrate that they work on real-world data sets that you might care about if you're like a chemist or something. Okay, and what I'm working on now is like actually close collaboration with some chemical engineers to leverage these ideas in real drug discovery pipelines. I don't want to make the claim that like we did anything significant in drug discovery. These are purely geometric deep learning contributions. Okay, and so I want to thank my advisor, Jenna Wiens, and I also want to thank some collaborators across the projects. And okay, since I have a bit of time, I will say this last thing. And this sentiment is shared, I believe, by all of the last year fellows. And so perhaps this is most useful for like the early incoming fellows. And it really is coming from like a sense of like perhaps deep gratitude and reflection. Okay, I don't think I have to spend any time convincing or like making people feel that like, I think everyone understands deep down what we're doing here, like why we do science, right? Why we would celebrate it and why we would do it. Science has this unique quality, this unique essence that when you encounter great science, it really does attract, it captivates, and it takes hold of you with great power. And no one will deny this. No one will ever deny this. But unfortunately, that's not the full picture of science, right? Sometimes, actually most times, you'll have advisor or funding or resource or department, all of these issues that could pop up and really detract away from that experience. But luckily for all of us in this room, we have this CSGF fellowship. And I feel like what it's done for me is that it's extracted the core and the essence of science. And I've always known, deep down in my soul, that what I've been doing in the PhD is that I've been engaging with and experiencing a beautiful science, one that I knew was honorable and noble, but above all else, one that was pure. And I want to thank the DOE, and I want to say that like this fellowship and everyone I've met along the way will always have a special place in my heart. And with that, I can conclude. Thank you very much.